All right, welcome everyone. Thank you for being here. My name is Aaron Grade. I'm on the National Climate Assessment Team at the U.S. Global Research Program, U.S. Global Change Research Program, or USGCRP. Before we get started, I just want to draw your attention to the note in the chat box. Audio is disabled for all participants, but if you have questions or comments throughout today's session, please enter them in the chat. If you have any technical difficulties, please contact Eliza, who's our tech support person today. Please also note that all participants are expected to be respectful and considerate towards others per the USGCRP Code of Conduct. Next slide, please. All right, I'll kick off our webinar today with some background information about the National Climate Assessment before turning it over to the Forest chapter authors. Next slide. So the U.S. Global Change Research Program was mandated by Congress in the Global Change Research Act of 1990 to assist the nation and the world to understand, assess, predict, and respond to human-induced and natural processes of global change. The program convenes 14, now 15 agencies to advance climate and global change science and provide useful and usable information to decision makers. Next slide. The same law that established the program also mandates a periodic scientific assessment known as the National Climate Assessment, or the NCA. The NCA is a quadrennial report that analyzes the effects of global change on several sectors: the natural environment, agriculture, energy, land and water resources, transportation, human health, social systems, and biodiversity. US GCRP is charged with assessing current trends as well as projections for the next 25 to 100 years. The science is used by organizations and individuals for a variety of purposes, including national policymaking, risk management in the private sector, local mitigation and adaptation planning, as well as by practitioners, utility managers, and informal education. Next slide. The NCA authors review a large body of, I think you have to go back to the previous slide there. They review a large body of scientific research from diverse information sources, synthesize that information, examine the confidence in our scientific understanding, and evaluate uncertainties. NCA5 was written by 500 authors and 260 technical contributors from every state in the nation, as well as Puerto Rico, the U.S. Virgin Islands, Guam, and Palau. The NCA is designed to be policy relevant. Authors distill their findings into accessible language framed around risks to people and important resources. That said, the report is strictly not policy prescriptive and does not advocate for particular viewpoints or policy measures. The NCA uses a range of future projections to help decision makers understand the full extent of possible risks that can be avoided or reduced under different scenarios, and leaves it up to the decision maker to ultimately determine their risk threshold. The assessment is compliant with all applicable federal laws and policies, including the Global Change Research Act, as well as other laws that govern things like information quality, accessibility, and transparency. Finally, the report process involves extensive review, including several opportunities for public engagement, a review by the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine, and several government science reviews. Next slide, please. Now let's take a look at the NCA5 table of contents. I think it was the previous, yep, there we go, table of contents. Like previous NCAs, NCA5 covers national level topics, regions, and response actions. The report opens with an overview chapter, which is followed by 2 chapters dedicated to the physical science of climate change. Then there are the national topic chapters, the 10 regional chapters, and 2 response chapters, although response actions were also discussed throughout the report. The NCA table of contents has evolved over time, informed by user input. NCA5 added 2 new chapters, one on economics and one on social systems and justice. We also have 5 new focus features on compound extreme events, Western wildfires, COVID-19, supply chains, and blue carbon. We also have several appendices, including a new one dedicated to indicators. Now that we've gone through some introductory background, it's my pleasure to introduce Grant Domke, the chapter lead of the Forest chapter, who will lead us through the remainder of the webinar today. Thank you.
Thanks, Aaron. I think I'm going to take over here. Grant, could you show us the next slide?
Oh, great. So this is Chris Fettig, who is the chapter coordinating lead author of the forest chapter. Thanks, Chris.
Thanks, Aaron. Yes, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Chris Fettig. I'm a research entomologist with the Pacific Southwest Research Station. I've also had the honor and privilege of serving as the federal coordinating lead author of the forest chapter of the 5th National Climate Assessment. I'd like to begin by welcoming you to today's webinar, as well as highlighting some of the importance of forests in the United States. Our forests provide immense ecological, economic, and social goods and services to natural systems and humankind. They also represent a pretty significant portion of our land base, about a third of it, somewhere on the order of about 766 million acres, with the amount of forest remaining relatively stable over the last 100 years, despite substantial land use changes into and out of forests, particularly in recent decades. They also contribute significantly to our economy. Forests contribute greater than 4% to our gross domestic product, about $300 billion in 2020, about $336 billion in 2022. The figure on the right there shows you the distribution of forests in the United States, as well as the predominant ownership patterns. You can see that most of the forests in the East are privately owned, while most of the forests in the West are federally managed. The vulnerability of our forests to climate change varies due to differences in biophysical conditions. You'll hear more about that here today, as well as local and regional variations in climate. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Grant Domke, the chapter lead author. Grant?
Thank you, Chris. And thanks very much for providing that sort of context for the rest of the chapter. My name is Grant Domke. I'm a research scientist with the U.S. Forest Service Northern Research Station, and I was the lead author on the forest chapter for the 5th assessment. So I'm going to give you just a brief overview on what's new in Chapter 7, or the forest chapter, since NCA4. So just a quick overview. Forests in the U.S. are increasingly affected by continued warming, changing precipitation patterns, and climate-related disturbances. These changes are limiting the capacity of forests to sequester and store carbon, provide clean water and air, produce a variety of products and ecosystem services, and offer opportunities for recreation. Improved adaptation efforts can help maintain resilient forest ecosystems. Much of this message existed in NCA4 and previous assessments, but what's new in NCA5 is how climate-related disturbances are leading to ecological transformations. We describe this. The attribution over the entire report, we're able to better attribute climate and climate-related disturbances and how those things are having impacts on natural systems, as well as the built environment and other ecosystems. How are changes affecting communities, and what benefits from forests are being compromised due to climate and climate-related disturbances? And then finally, we were very intentional in this chapter to sort of end with solutions, provide activities and examples of real-world activities that are happening. So we end with proactive adaptation for forest management examples, and how these can help create, maintain, and restore resilient forest ecosystems in the United States. Before we go any further, I really want to acknowledge that this chapter was made up of a fantastic group of federal scientists. This was one of 3 federal chapters. So before Chris and I were asked to lead the chapter, it was decided that this would be one of the federally led chapters. So you'll see many folks from the U.S. Forest Service, U.S. Geological Survey, the U.S. EPA contributed to the chapter, as well as several technical contributors, again, from federal agencies. I want to acknowledge our review editor, Brooke Eastman from West Virginia University, and then, of course, the fantastic staff at USGCRP who helped continue to help really throughout this process of delivering this report and also doing outreach activities. So fantastic thanks to all of them. And with that, I would like to turn it over to three of my co-authors. We sort of designated the next three speakers as key message leads. So for the first key message, we've got Dave Peterson here, who will be sharing the key message and some results from the first section of the chapter. Take it away, Dave.
Hey, hello, everyone. I'm Dave Peterson. I'm an emeritus senior scientist with the U.S. Forest Service Pacific Northwest Research Station. And we're going to jump into some of the ecological effects on forest ecosystems across the United States here. The topics that you see highlighted in bold there mostly relate to disturbances in ecosystems, interactions among disturbance agents, and how the effects of those disturbances will alter forest ecosystem characteristics. Now, much of what is discussed in this key message is similar to the topics discussed in National Climate Assessment, the fourth National Climate Assessment. However, at this point in time, we have much more documentation on the effects of climate change in forests, and we also have greater confidence in how the trajectory of future changes will occur. So we're feeling a little better about things in terms of scientific information available and how things will unfold into the future. Next. So when people think of forest disturbance, they tend to think of wildfires first and foremost. There's so much information in the media on this, it's hard to avoid. Here are the data of forest area burned in the US over the last 30 plus years. And we can see by looking at those gray bars that in general, area burned on an annual basis has increased, but with a lot of variation of ups and downs in that graph. We can also see that, as you might expect, carbon dioxide emissions track the wildfire data pretty closely, and there's some other non-CO2 greenhouse gases emitted as well. So this is a very broad and important context, and I'd like to call your attention to the units on that right axis. We're in the hundreds of millions of metric tons per year, somewhere between 100 and 250 million tons each year due just to wildfire. So very important context of what has been happening recently. Next. In this figure, we see an illustration of very large fires. Now, very large fires are defined as those fires that are 12,000 acres or greater. And on the left side, the average number of days is indicated historically. And we see that most of that is in the West. The highest numbers are in the West, at least historically. And that as we move to the right figure, which is a projection of what we expect those very large fire days to be in the future, we see a rather dramatic increase in the percentage noted there. Again, there's a lot in the West, but we also see some darker colors occurring in the Southeast as well. So why is this important? This is important because it suggests that we may have what many people call a longer fire season in the future. Basically, more days in which the weather conditions are such and the fuel dryness conditions are such that we can have very large fires if we have appropriate ignitions at that time. So this does not guarantee us anything about being able to predict the area burn or number of fires burned, but it suggests that we will have more fires and we'll have more days in which big fires can happen. Next. So just to sum up the last couple of slides, historical data suggests that we haven't had a change in fire frequency, at least not yet, but we have had an increased area burned. We're also getting increased fire severity, at least in some places, and we're also getting a lot more smoke produced, and that smoke is being transmitted across the US and beyond. In the future, we do expect more fires. We expect a longer fire season. We expect this continuation of a trajectory of more smoke production. And then finally, something to think about is we might expect more large fires, but we're also starting to see these patches of big fires start to connect. So at some point, there might be a negative feedback there that will limit the potential for fires to continue to get larger. At the bottom of this figure, we see this item on ignitions. Now, over 80% of our wildfires are caused by people in one way or another through their actions, infrastructure, and so forth. And we have this effect of wildland-urban interface areas as well. So we expect that there will be some social input to how fires evolve in the future and how some of the things I've just talked about will change in the future. Next. Now, as important as fires are, insects often affect just as many trees per year in terms of mortality as fires do, which may surprise some people. This figure shows a photo on the left of a spruce beetle outbreak on the Bridger-Teton National Forest in Wyoming. And on the right side, we have a western pine beetle outbreak in the Sierra National Forest in California. So these have been two big players in terms of large-scale effects of insects over the last 3 decades or so. And one thing we know a lot about is that many of our insect populations are exacerbated by higher temperatures. Next. And our primary concerns here are that, first of all, insect outbreaks may become more frequent when we've really had some big changes in the last 30 years. In addition, some of our insect species that have the biggest effects, particularly bark beetles, will probably continue to expand their range, including the southern pine beetle. So this is a species that was formerly confined to the southeastern United States and has already expanded up into the New England portion of the US. So we see that there's even greater potential in the future for some of these insects to expand into new areas and different species than where they've been seen in the past. We also are concerned about interactions between insects and wildfire and other stressors as well. And then finally, combined with wildfire, insects will probably continue to cause the forest landscape to look younger, with younger trees, different stand structure, and so forth being more common in the future. Next. Now, these big picture disturbances like fire and insects tend to get most of the attention, but we also have other things that are happening out there as a result of gradual increase in temperature and so forth. And one of those is sea level rise. Here we see a photo of what's called ghost forest, and this is near the Blackwater National Wildlife Refuge in Maryland. So in this case, we're seeing that due to sea level rise, we're having saltwater intrusion into groundwater. That groundwater then essentially becomes toxic to some species of trees and just kills them. And there's no chance that trees will be coming back in that particular part of the landscape. We're also seeing sea level rise effects in other areas of coastal North America, especially in the Southeast, and mangrove forest in Florida being another example. This might seem like an isolated sort of issue, but in fact, one of the impacts that we see when these types of forests are killed off along the coast is that if these areas are replaced by tidal wetlands, there will be a bigger effect in terms of ecological change, as well as a decreased buffering capacity against storm surges. So it's not just one thing in most cases for climate change effects in forests, but there's usually this cascade of potential effects. Next. This figure is a summary of some of the things that we feel that we know about up to this point in time based on the scientific literature across different forest types on the left side and across different ecosystem components across the top of the figure. And so we've been observing climate change related tree mortality in pretty much all of our forests to date. And we're also seeing decreases in carbon storage in many of our forests, as well as some tree species range shifts. You'll notice that the columns under forest structure and understory species range shifts have much less indication of actual quantitative changes and a reduced confidence of what we're thinking about in terms of the scientific literature that's available to document those changes. So some really big picture, high confidence statements can be made, but also there's a lot of work left to be done in terms of filling in some of those gaps. Next. So what I'd like to leave you with here in key message 1 is a little bit of a look into the future and what might be important for the 6th National Climate Assessment. First of all, this changing age and stand structure that we feel like we're seeing now and will probably continue to be more prominent in the future is not only documenting those changes, but how they're affecting both ecological and social values. Also, our forests, as they get younger, may have reduced capability of forest regeneration in some areas. So we need to keep an eye on that and consider whether we may need to be doing more planting of trees in some areas. And then finally, we really need to get more scientific information on a number of different topics, the most important of which are forest diseases. We have very little scientific literature to help us with that. We need more information on understory species, things other than trees. And then finally, multiple interacting stressors. We know this is important. We tend to study one thing at a time. And I think that more interdisciplinary studies and analyses will really help inform our projections of future changes in forest ecosystems. So we can now go to key message 2.
All right. Well, thank you, Dave Peterson, for that important summary of key message 1 and its findings about how forests are increasingly affected by climate change and climate change-driven disturbances. My name is Jeff Presteman, Senior Scientist in the Southern Research Station of the Forest Service, and I'm located in Research Triangle Park, North Carolina. In key message 2, we focus on how those changes are affecting forest-based ecosystem services. Among the services affected that we focus on in this part of the forest chapter are the sequestration of carbon provided by forests, the provision of clean and abundant water, the production of timber and non-timber products, and forest-based recreation, among some other things. As society changes in the future, the capacity of forests to provide those kinds of services are likely to be affected by climate change and related disturbances. Now, I want to talk about some specific ecosystem service trends that we documented in this chapter that offer evidence of the observed recent impacts of climate change on forests in the United States. Next slide, please. One trend observed in the last 2 decades has been the rising level of wildfire-generated particulate matter in smoke, which was referred to earlier, resulting from increasing wildfire area burned in the United States. This graph here shows that wildfire-generated PM 2.5, that's particulate matter that is 2.5 microns in diameter and smaller, which is associated with higher human morbidity and mortality. This share has been rising as a proportion of all PM 2.5 in the atmosphere. So wildfires burning a growing amount of forests are generating pollution that's hurting more and more people. Next slide. Wildfires not only harm people through their smoke, they're destroying the houses that people live in. We show in this graph the number of residences lost to wildfires was higher in the last decade compared to the previous 2 decades. So while wildfire is a critical ecosystem process, as the focus feature on Western wildfires shows in this new section of the National Climate Assessment, describes they've become hotter and more destructive with climate change, and development has put more houses at risk. The result is that more houses are burning up. Next slide. Another forest disturbance which is connected to climate is the extent of bark beetle outbreaks. They've mentioned it, including western bark beetles, which injure and kill coniferous trees in the western US. Dead and dying trees emit carbon to the atmosphere and also negatively impact amenity values. Research documents that part of the amenity value loss from bark beetle attacks is capitalized into the value of nearby properties. In other words, homes are worth less as a result of bark beetle outbreaks, exacerbated in some cases by climate change. Next slide. Okay, well, burning and beetle-attacked trees are not the only manifestations of how a changing climate is affecting forests in the United States. The advance of mangroves in the continental US is an example of one of the many ecological transformations occurring as a result of climate change that Grant Domke referred to earlier today. As climate warms, mangrove forests are spreading north, becoming increasingly common along the Gulf and Atlantic coasts. Data describing this trend are shown here in this slide from the mid-1980s to the early 2010s. Mangrove forest extent has increased in Florida north of 28 degrees north latitude. When mangrove forests colonize coastal areas, they often replace saltwater marshes, reducing the ecosystem services that marshes offer, including fishing and other recreational opportunities. Next slide. Climate is affecting not only saltwater, but freshwater, and it's affecting the water-related ecosystem services provided by forests in interior parts of the United States. In this graph, we show how different projected rises in air temperatures translates into loss of habitat suitable for cold water fish. So as climate warms, there are fewer cold water fishing opportunities, including in the forest-dominated southern Appalachian region of the United States, where this cold water is produced. Next slide. Finally, I want to talk about an important ecosystem service provided by forests, and that is sequestering of carbon. Forests and trees in the United States sequester the equivalent of nearly 13% of gross U.S. emissions of greenhouse gases economy-wide. Yet trends show that this sequestration capacity has declined over the past 3 decades, particularly in the interior U.S. West and on public lands. In this slide, keep in mind that more negative numbers imply more sequestration. So the positively sloped solid line for public lands means that public forests in the United States are sequestering less and less carbon over time. That kind of contraction in sequestration is due to more than just one factor, but it's partially attributed to the higher rates of disturbances we've talked about earlier. So not only are disturbances directly impacting human health and the things that people value, they're contributing to the progressive weakening of the carbon sequestration ecosystem service generating capacity of forests, which has historically helped to compensate for fossil fuel generated greenhouse gas emissions in the United States. Next up, Jessica Holofsky is going to describe how adaptation actions could be used to reduce some of the effects of climate change on forests. Over to you, Jessica.
Great, thank you, Jeff. Hi, everyone. I'm Jessica Holofsky. I'm director of the USDA Northwest Climate Hub and the Forest Service Western Threat Assessment Center, and with the Pacific Northwest Research Station of the Forest Service. So I'm covering the third key message of the chapter, which is focused on adaptation. So we have high confidence that climate change is resulting and will continue to result in more challenges for natural resource managers. And it will become more difficult to maintain the function, health, and productivity of forests. So climate change vulnerability assessments for forests that help inform development and implementation of adaptation actions are needed to maintain resilient forests that continue to provide the ecosystem services we depend upon, some of which Jeff just covered. Next slide, please. So since the last national climate assessment, there's been considerable progress in development of climate change vulnerability assessments to guide adaptation in forests. So these have been developed by federal agencies, states and state agencies, communities, non-governmental organizations, and tribes. There's an example from the state of Pennsylvania here. There's also been an acceleration in development of tools, frameworks, and guides for adaptation. So for example, there are tools like the Climate Change Adaptation Library shown here. Another example is the Resist, Accept, Direct framework, or RAD, which was developed by the Department of the Interior to help guide thinking around adaptation for forest ecosystems. Next slide, please. So going back to this figure that Chris touched on briefly, we know that there are really diverse patterns in ownership of forest ecosystems across the country. And so this, from an adaptation perspective, presents both opportunities and challenges. So different landowners and managers can innovate and share what they learn about climate change adaptation. But then implementing adaptation actions across large landscapes can be difficult with mixed ownership patterns. So implementation of adaptation practices in forests are now much more widespread. And we have examples marked here with numbers. When I'm going to go through a few of these examples in each of the next slides, but each of these numbers represents an implementation of an adaptation action in forests on the ground. Next slide. Okay, so for each of these slides, we have a climate change effect on the left and then an adaptation response that has been implemented on the right. So there is more information on these examples if you're interested in table 7.1 in the chapter. So this example is focused on wildfire. We have high confidence that climate change will result in longer wildfire seasons and increased area burned. So in drought-prone temperate forests, reducing tree densities increases resilience or the ability to recover after disturbance to insects like bark beetles and drought. And when we combine with fuel reduction treatments like prescribed fire or thinning, they also increase the resilience to wildfire. So in fire-prone forest ecosystems, reintroducing low to mixed severity fire and incorporating indigenous knowledge into fire management can help reduce the risk of high severity fire and promote valued ecosystem services. So we have quite a few examples of how this type of adaptation response has been implemented, including in Eastern Washington by the Washington Department of Natural Resources, and also by tribes in Northern California, among others. Next slide, please. Thanks. All right, with warming temperatures and changing disturbance regimes, some trees may not be well adapted to the climatic conditions of the future. So adapting reforestation practices, including where species are planted and which species and genotypes are planted, can help to facilitate adaptation to future climatic conditions. So we have an increasing number of examples of trials being implemented to experiment with different species and genotypes. So we have examples on Nature Conservancy land in upstate New York, Nature Conservancy and National Park Service land in Northeast Ohio, and National Forest System land in the Pacific Northwest. Next slide, please. And for this one, in many cases, climate change adaptation plans developed by other agencies or organizations are not well suited to the needs and values of tribal nations. So several groups led by the Forest Service Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science and the Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission collaborated with the Ojibwe and Menominee people to develop a climate change adaptation menu. And this menu integrated the perspectives, languages, concepts, and values of the tribe. So this menu is now being adapted for other tribes, being used as an example to help with similar efforts for other tribal nations. Okay, next slide. Yeah, in many parts of the country, increased intensity of rainstorms is likely to lead to increased flooding. And we know more flooding will cause more damage to infrastructure, including that for recreation. And many people, including myself, like to camp along streams and rivers. So there are a lot of day use areas and campsites built in floodplains. But these are likely to be increasingly damaged by flooding, which will increase maintenance costs and in some cases could put public safety at risk. So an adaptation response to this risk of more flooding is to move campgrounds and other recreation sites out of floodplains. And we have an example of this on the Mark Twain National Forest in Missouri. One of their sites is shown here. Next slide. And a final example I want to share is related to hurricane damage. So projections suggest that hurricane intensity may increase with climate change, resulting in damage to forests. This is likely to especially affect the Southeast and the Caribbean. And Puerto Rico has experienced several intense hurricanes in recent years. So the Caribbean Climate Hub has worked with land managers there to develop hurricane preparedness and recovery strategies. And one of the strategies which has been implemented is to come up with ways to derive commercial value from the trees that are damaged by the hurricanes. And damaged trees can be used to develop furniture, musical instruments, and other products, which has the added benefit of storing carbon in harvested wood products. So I just want to share a few of these examples of the progress being made and adapting to climate change. and they provide information that others can emulate and work from. Hopefully we'll have many more examples of these to draw from by the time of the next National Climate Assessment. So I'll turn it over to Grant. Thanks.
Thank you, Jessica. That was a fantastic end. So yeah, I would just like to close sort of the three key messages out by reminding all of you online that all of the information, the likelihood and confidence statements for each key message are supported by a traceable accounts section at the end of the chapter. I saw in the chat that there were many questions about references, citations. All of those can be found in the chapter in the reference section, and then a detailed description on the confidence and likelihood statements throughout the chapter is available in that traceable accounts section. So I encourage you to have a look at that. I'd also like to acknowledge or say, you know, hopefully you've seen here how we've advanced since the 4th National Climate Assessment, and also point out that we've identified through this process that there's a lot of work yet to be done. And so the 6th National Climate Assessment will be as important as ever to continue to unpack and describe the weight of evidence supporting patterns and process in forests and really all aspects of the National Climate Assessment. I'd also like to acknowledge again what a great pleasure it's been leading this chapter and working with this fantastic author team, all the technical contributors, review editor, and my colleagues at USGCRP. It's really been a humbling experience and really one of the highlights of my career. So many, many thanks to everyone that contributed to this report. And with that, I'm going to take us to the final slide. You can find more information at nca2023.globalchange.gov. This chapter, as well as all the other chapters, are there, and the PDF files will be available in the months ahead if you'd like to download those and have sort of a hard copy of those. And with that, I would like to turn it back over to Aaron to start fielding questions. And I invite all of my co-authors that are with us today to go ahead and turn your cameras on, and we can start.